Okay, good evening, everyone.
I think I know.
We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're running a little behind, so if people could take their seats and do the introductions. Okay, so first of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming out this weekend to Platypus 5th International Convention on the theme Utopia program. This is our plenary dedicated to that theme. And we're very excited to have this lineup of speakers. I just want to make a couple of announcements and kind of descriptions of what Platypus does. So Platypus is an organization that's primarily based out of universities in many countries around the world. And the work that we do is to host the conversation. And we do this by hosting panel discussions such as this tonight, as well as the other events that you've attended this weekend. We also publish the Platypus Review, which you'll be able to find the latest issue of outside in the lobby, issue 55. And we do reading groups at various campus chapters in our different locations. If you'd like to know more about what's going on in Chicago, on the last page of the program, which most of you probably have, and if you don't, there's a few copies outside, you can see our list of weekly events. We do coffee breaks, which are kind of an informal opportunity for people to come and discuss whatever essentially is on their mind when it comes to left politics today and historically in an informal setting. This also has the listing of the reading groups available in Chicago. And if you're interested in finding out, what Platypus does, reviewing our archive of both the issues of the Platypus Review as well as our media archive, you can go to our website, which is listed in the program at www.platypus1917.org. My name is Ben Blumberg. I'm a founding member of the organization, and I'll be moderating tonight. After the speakers have about 10 to 12 or so minutes to make their initial opening remarks, we'll allow each one to have a few minutes to respond to the remarks of their fellow panelists, and then we'll open it on to audience question and answer, and hopefully we'll be able to get to the audience question and answer in a kind of timely fashion such that we can have a real good discussion between the floor and the podium and the stage. I just will ask that people keep their remarks in a question format as much as possible, and keep them under a minute if at all possible, so that we can get as many questions as we can. Wentai will be going around with the wireless mic, so you'll raise your hand and she'll come to you and take your question. Then we'll give each panelist a chance to respond as they so choose. And then we'll have closing remarks, which will be kind of about 2 minutes at the end. So I would like to just read the theme for the plenary and for the convention as a whole. So Utopia and program. What possibilities might remain for a left whose goal is no longer utopian and whose path is no longer programmatically defined? Program and utopia have for well over a century now sat in an uneasy tension within the politics of the left, in tension both with each other and within themselves. Political programs tend to be presented in the sober light of practicability, straightforward, realistic, matter-of-fact. Social utopias, by contrast, appear quite oppositely as the virtue of aspiring ambition, involved, unrealistic, exhilarating. Historically, then, the two would appear to be antithetical. In either case, one usually offers itself as a corrective to the other. The programmatic as a harsh reality check to the pipe dream idealism, utopianism as an alternative to dreary, cynical Realpolitik. Today, however, it is unavoidable that both program and utopia are in profound crisis. For those leftists who still hold out some hope for the possibility of extra-electoral politics, an impasse has arisen. Despite the effusive political outbursts of 2011 and 2012 in the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, with their emphasis on the identity of means and ends, anti-hierarchical modes of organizing, and utopian prefiguration, the left still seems to have run aground. Traces remain in the forms of various issue-based affinity groups, but the more ambitious project of achieving sweeping social transformation has been quietly put to rest, consoled with the mere memory of possibility. Meanwhile, long-standing left organizations, having temporarily reverted to the usual waiting game of patiently tailing popular discontents with the status quo until the masses finally come around and decide to get with the program, that is, their program, have experienced a crisis of their own, slowly disintegrating with the occasional spectacular implosions many of their dedicated cadre call it quits amid demoralization and recriminations. What possibilities might remain for a left whose goal is no longer utopian, and whose path, rather, is no longer programmatically defined? That's our theme, and we've asked the panelists to respond to a series of questions. We didn't expect that they would each respond to all of them. We know that would be quite impossible. So hopefully they've used them as just a kind of guide to their remarks. So I'd like to just now introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking, which happens to not be the order in which they're sitting, unfortunately. So we're going to start with Sam Gindin. Sorry, Roger Rashi, my fault. Roger Rashi is a founding member of the political party Quebec Solidaire and sits in the steering committee of the riding of Mercier, who first elected Amir Kadir, I'm sorry, can you pronounce that?
Kadir.
Kadir, to the Quebec National Assembly in December of 2008 and re-elected him with a bigger majority in 2012. The party, which was formed in 2006, currently holds 2 seats in the Quebec legislature. Rashi was also a member of the Quebec Solidaire's Working Commission on the Environment from 2007 to 2012, and recently helped found the Network of Eco-Socialists, an eco-socialist of Quebec activists. Following Sam following Roger will be Sam Gindin. Sam Gindin is the former research director of the Canadian Auto Workers Union and co-author with Leo Panich of The Making of Global Capitalism. After retirement from the CAW in 2000, he joined the faculty of York University in the Political Science Department as the Packer Visitor in Social Justice, where he taught until 2010. He is currently involved in organizing the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly as a model to link the working class across union and community organizations. Following Sam will be speaking Stephen Eric Bronner. Stephen Eric Bronner is a noted political philosopher and professor of political science, comparative literature, and German studies at Rutgers University, and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He's a prolific writer, having published over 25 books and 200 journal articles. He's the author of Rosa Luxemburg, A Revolutionary for Our Times, Socialism Unbound, Of Critical Theory and Its Theorists, and Reclaiming the Enlightenment, towards the politics of radical engagement, among many others. His most recent book is Modernism at the Barricades, Aesthetics, Politics, and Utopia. Following Stephen will be Aaron. Aaron is a member of the EndNotes Collective. EndNotes is a communist journal available in print, but all texts are available for free online at endnotes.org.uk. And then concluding will be Richard Rubin, who is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So with all that, I now turn it over to Roger to begin our discussion tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight, and I'm honored to be on a panel with such distinguished guests. Now, I'm not a professional academic, more or less a professional activist. So a lot of my remarks will basically attempt to weave theory and practice together as I understand it and as I've been living through it in Quebec and in the movement that we're trying to build in Quebec, Quebec Solidaire, a new anti-neoliberal political party with elements of going beyond capitalism in its program. So if we look at the question of utopia and program and the contradiction which has been raised in the opening remarks between utopia and program, I will start with the question of whether these two can be synthesized, these two can be united or merged in a new formulation in our time, at the beginning of the 21st century. I think we can. I don't think it's easy, but I think we can. And I think we can follow the example of Marx back in the middle of the 19th century. I am convinced that in that I have followed the writings of a French Marxist philosopher called Henri Lefebvre, who has pointed out that what Marx actually did was a synthesis between the utopian trend in French socialism and the political trend within French socialism. And out of that developed a synthesis which actually provided a form of politicization of utopia. In other words, he took the aim of what was a utopian socialist movement in the mid-1800s in France, which was moving towards a classless society and a stateless society. And he looked at what the political socialists were advancing, which one has to seize state power in order to transform things. And out of that wove a synthesis which said that in order to advance towards a classless society, we had to seize power and formulated the hypothesis that by seizing political power, eventually through a series of stages, we could arrive at a classless society. Now, of course, this synthesis was somewhat put to the test in the 20th century and has not come out unscathed. Can we attempt to do that again in the 21st century? I believe we can. But it's a difficult process that cannot be done without being involved in mass struggles and without being involved in the anti-neoliberal movements which are emerging worldwide. So, if we look at what is the left today, yes, indeed, the political expression of the left is in crisis. But there's also what we can call the social movement, or the social left. And I think we've seen in the first decade of the 21st century a rise of mass movements challenging neoliberalism. And it has taken two forms. We've seen it develop in Latin America around what has been called the pink tide, Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador, an attempt to use state power to move towards gradually a form of socialism, but it is not socialism yet. But we have seen the neoliberal movements attempt to transform gradually society. And we've seen, over the past 3 years, a new arc of struggle develop in the Middle East, in Southern Europe, through the tremendous movement of the Arab Spring and the ongoing movement of fighting austerity in Southern Europe. Can we, out of that, craft a new political expression for the left that will synthesize utopia, the goal of a classless society eventually, and program the practical movement towards formulating this kind of program? I think we can. And one of the ways of doing it is attempting to come back to a vision of communism, which I think Marx had in the middle of the 18th century. Quickly speaking, there's three ways in which we can understand the word communism. We can understand it as a form of organization, as we've seen it expressed in the 20th century through Communist Party. We can understand it in what Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, is attempting to develop, i.e. as a hypothesis, i.e. an ethic to which we can struggle. It's not based on a class struggle, but based on some form of an ethical struggle. Or we can understand it in terms of the actual movement attempting to abolish it, to abolish the existing state of things. In other words, communism is not just a program, it's not just a utopia, but it's also the practical movement of struggling against the existing state of things. And I think it's in that perspective that we can understand the new left parties which have emerged or attempting to emerge in different parts of the world, including my own, which is exhilarating. We have tried to move from a conception of a political united front against neoliberalism, bringing the social movement into a political expression through a party that would engage in election, but at the same time engage in mass struggles, what we call combining the ballot and the street. And out of that, gradually move towards an understanding of what it is to overcome neoliberalism and overcome the basis of neoliberalism, which is the capitalist system. Now, this is a difficult process, and I don't think it can be done as we have done it in the 60s or the 70s. We have to adopt new forms of organizations, new form of understanding what is a political party, which is not a commandist party, which is not necessarily a vanguard party as we understood it. Neither is it a reformist structure, such as the classical social democratic party. We see an attempt to do that, and it's probably the clearest attempt to do that with Syriza in Greece. And I think you've seen in the formulation that the Greek comrade has given, the attempt to work out, moving from the anti-austerity struggle that they have now, formulating a practical program of possibly seizing state power, and how you could gradually transform the correlation of forces into something which would open up the door to a new society. I think we've seen that also partially in Latin America with the three examples I've given before: Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. This is a difficult process, but I think it is a form that reconstituting a left-wing expression and political parties can take in this century, can take in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, how can you practically move an organization and party which is based on fighting neoliberalism into something which expresses a new vision of socialism. Can it be done? Part of the way I think we're trying to do it in Quebec is by allowing the existence in our party of left-wing collectives. And there are collectives from the Communist Party of Quebec, from the Socialist Left, which is affiliated to the Fourth International, from International Socialism, from the International Marxist Tendency, etc., etc. I think there's 7 or 8 recognized collectives. What we've tried to do in the past few weeks is at least form a network of 3 or 4 of the existing collectives in Quebec Solidaire around the vision of developing eco-socialism. Why have we done that? Partially it relates to the mass struggles that we've gone through in the past year in Quebec. There's been a tremendously radical student movement that was able to move from a student strike to a massive populist struggle against neoliberalism. It started with a fight to freeze tuition hikes, and it ended up in a literal uprising of hundreds of thousands of people against the existing provincial government in Quebec. And there's 2 key moments in the transformation of the sectional struggle into a struggle against neoliberalism with potential radical implications. One was a demonstration on April 22nd, 2012, on Earth Day, a demonstration which was called actually by the environmental movements to oppose the reactionary policy of the Canadian federal government. And this demonstration on Earth Day linked up with a student mass struggle, and we ended up having a huge demonstration of nearly 300,000 people in the streets of Montreal. Out of this attempt to merge different struggles into a generalized opposition to neoliberalism, other mass demonstrations were called for. And eventually, when it came to the crux of the matter, around mid-May, when the provincial government decided to outlaw demonstration, adopted an extremely repressive law, which forbade any demonstration of over 50 people. What happened is a demonstration which was called on May 22nd, in fact, opposed this call and completely contravened the law, and was a massive instance of 300,000 people engaging in an act of civil disobedience. That same night, on the following days, police repression increased to an incredible degree against the student activists, and something like 500 of them were arrested in a period of 48 hours. And we were coming to a crucial point where police was about to repress and shut down the movement. And what happened is an amazing development, which has not yet been analyzed. But all of a sudden, the call was put out to start massive demonstrations around the working class neighborhoods in Montreal. The call was put out on Facebook, and literally tens of thousands of people started coming out in a spontaneous way, night after night, for a period of 2 weeks, in the various working class neighborhoods of Montreal, driving the police crazy because they could not repress 5, 6, 7, 8 demonstrations, exploding at the same time in different areas, and linking themselves up at different parts of the city without any pre-planned, an advice or announcing how and where they were going to work. That created a situation where the government could not repress the student movement and was forced to announce that they were going to call elections and submit it to the people. Since they were not able to stop the movement was continuing, and mass movements were developing outside of strictly the student movement in society. So we've seen this kind of sectional student movement developing to a mass struggle, new forms of urban movements developing in the working class neighborhoods of Montreal, and engaging in a practical rejection of neoliberalism. So the question is, where do we go now, and how do we try and consolidate that into not only a left-wing anti-capitalist party, but also in terms of social movements, which are able to move forward and challenge the system. Part of the way is also engaging labor in that, and making sure that this kind of new radicalism enters the ranks of labor, because students, after they finish the school, eventually have to go on the labor market and get jobs. Some of them will decide, and some of them have decided to either join community organization or enter the ranks of organized labor. So hopefully this new generation of activists which have come out of this mass movement, will bring in this tradition of mass struggle and help to change the orientation of the labor movement. Another thing that we do is try to bring in these dozens and hundreds of new activists into our party, into Quebec Solidaire. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is by developing this eco-socialist network and bring in students who want to challenge the system and go beyond capitalism, and also try and engage them into a struggle to participate in the ongoing political expression of what is an attempt to develop a new form of left-wing party, which is our party, Quebec Solidaire. Now, will all this end up giving results and bearing fruits? I don't think we can say so, and I don't think we can right now establish that the Syriza way or that kind of attempt to change the system will succeed, but I don't think we can afford not to engage in this kind of battle. I don't think we can afford not to engage in the social movements. I don't think we can afford not to engage in bringing the social movement into new forms of expression through new left parties such as Syriza, Quebec Solidaire, the Left Front in France, or the Red Green Alliance in Denmark, or the Left Bloc in Portugal. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions. Thank you.
Sam Gindin.
Okay, I want to address what is it we do at this historical moment when the defeat of both labor, the traditional base of the left, and the left itself has been so profound. And I want to emphasize how profound I think that defeat has been. There's always examples of positive things that are happening, but they end up to be quite localized or sporadic. It's not clear whether they can be sustained, whether they will spread. And what strikes me is that, you know, we've lived now through more than a generation, for a lot of people here, most of their lives, of this defeat, without us being able to develop a counter-response. And when the crisis hit, it really brought home, I think, to all of us, how weak we really were. Here was a crisis in which capital should have been delegitimated, not just finance, but capitalism itself. And the fact is that it's the labor movement that's on the defensive again. So we have to take this defeat seriously. And I think when we're thinking about what's the barrier here, is the barrier a lack of vision, a lack of program? I think we have to understand the barrier in terms of fatalism. It used to be that they would buy us off. They don't buy us off anymore. They just tell us now that this is the way it is, and there's nothing you can do about it. And people do feel like there's nothing they can do about it because they haven't had the structures through which they can work to change things. They've survived individually. And so I think the critical question for us at this moment is the organizational question. We have to be able to develop the kind of structures that give people the confidence that if you make a commitment to something, you can actually affect things, if not immediately, then later. And the comparison I made earlier in the day was to the 30s. And the last time we had a crisis this deep was in the 30s. And in the 30s, the form of unionism that existed at the time, in terms of craft unionism, proved completely inadequate. And workers, surprisingly, figured out another form of organization that was much more inclusive in terms of industrial unionism. They didn't do it alone. They did it in the context of socialists and communists, and that was very critical, even though very few workers themselves became socialists and communists. It was communists who had a vision and felt that they were part of something larger that had the confidence and the commitment to actually try what a lot of workers thought was crazy and develop a new form of working class organization. What is so amazing to me at this moment in time is although there's all kinds of different tactics tried, there really is so little discussion about finding new forms of organization, especially in the labor movement. And so what I want to do is, I want to propose something that seems kind of obvious and simple, and just throw it out for discussion. I think that what we need is an intermediate organization. And by intermediate, I mean something that lies between social movements and unions, which deal with either specific issues or specific groups. They're dealing with their own interests, even if sometimes the rhetoric goes beyond that, on the one hand, and then projects that are oriented towards the state, towards transforming the state, and towards transforming the society through transforming the state. That neither of those two options are actually open to us, in the sense that the movements and the unions are simply not, they don't match what we're up against. They're not an answer. And because the defeat of the left has been just as great, we can't say, well, let's turn to a party that focuses on the state and transforming society. So that is blocked as well. So we have to develop something that is, on the one hand, maybe less ambitious, but I think it's exceedingly ambitious, which is a new form of organization that's in between the two. And what that organization might address is three things. One is forming cells across workplaces to do education inside the workplace and across workplaces. And the reason that I emphasize across workplaces is that we have had over the last 30 years attempts to develop oppositions within unions. And I think they miss the whole point, the whole problem. When you're forming just an opposition within a union, you're still keeping your head inside that union. You're not dealing with the fact that unions are sectional organizations addressing the problems of a particular group of workers. We have to get workers fighting across unions. At some point, this will mean that you take on your own leadership, etc. But we have to start from the fact that what we're trying to do is get workers together across unions. Second of all, we have to take seriously the notion that class doesn't just exist in the workplace, that there are all kinds of dimensions of class, and we have to take on organizing on a class basis in the community. And that isn't about coalitions. It's not about joining others. It's about recognizing that this is other dimensions of our own lives. So it has to be in the community in that sense. It has to, third of all, start thinking about getting socialism on the agenda again, getting some notion of an alternative to the logic of capitalism on the agenda again. Because if we don't do that, we'll always be locked into the logic of capitalism. We can't do that because it's not competitive. It doesn't matter how democratic society is, there's only one place you can end up, because you have to support the accumulation of capital, whether you want to keep your job or support the welfare state, etc. So we have to start including in this kind of an organization the kind of education that starts moving us towards developing a socialist culture and confident socialists, and get socialism on the agenda again, and have all the kinds of debates that implies about vision, utopia, strategy, tactics. Now, one thing about this kind of politics is that I want to emphasize that it's not about coalitions. The trouble with coalitions is that they can work well to win a specific issue, but everybody retains their identity. They just move back to where they were, their fragmented sense. We have to see this as a new layer of politics, which people join as individuals. They can keep doing whatever work they're doing in the movements or in the unions, and they should, but they're doing this because they recognize that there's a gap and we need a new layer of politics. It means that that new layer of politics is going to be regionally based, because that's how you organize. You can only organize on a regional basis. We have to form these assemblies at the city level, which represent this new kind of politics, and they have to be based explicitly on class. They have to be based on anti-capitalism, which we can argue about what that means, but I think it basically has to at least mean that we're open to a radical challenge to capitalism. They have to be activists, and they have to respect the fact that activism without understanding isn't activism. That real organizers are intellectuals and activists. Now, I'm not going to go into all kinds of examples. I did quite a bit of that this morning, but I want to make two final points. The first thing is that this intermediate organization is not a transitional organization. I'm not trying to talk about something that exists until you are able to get a party. I think that this is something that has to exist even if there is a party. And I want to justify that as follows. Magri, the Italian communist, was studying and commenting on the failure of democracy in communist parties. And one of the things that he concluded was the problem wasn't any lack of constitutional rights or bad people or people just co-opting things. His conclusion was that it was inevitable in these kinds of parties because they developed so unevenly. There are some people who've had the time to study and to learn and are very confident and can speak and they get to travel, or they may be full-time, they may not be full-time. And then there's a lot of people who just join, come to some meetings, may have mid-level kinds of commitment, but they just can't compare, and therefore they're not a check on the leadership, no matter how it's democratically structured. And for that reason, unless you believe that it's possible to have some perfect communist party, I think that what you need is an institutional check on a new party whenever it does develop sometime. And then for that reason, I think that this notion of an intermediate organization, an assembly, should be there permanently. It might be a place where you recruit people to the party. It might be a place where you're developing the infrastructure for a party, but it should remain independent and always a check on the party. And then I want to conclude with, we've tried this in Toronto. We formed something called the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. It actually came out of an argument that Bill Fletcher had made in the US when he was trying to face the fact that the labor movement was almost non-existent in terms of membership. So if you're organizing workers, you had to go beyond the unions. And where the unions existed, you couldn't get in because of the labor bureaucracy. So he suggested actually organizing at the community. And we kind of developed it and thought we would try it. It hasn't really been tried in the States, although there's some discussions in Philadelphia and upper state New York right now. And as you heard yesterday, this is something that's been tried in some variation in Halifax. Ultimately, the idea is that you start at this level and then there's limits of organizing regionally, so you'd obviously have to think about a federation. But I just want to highlight some of the problems we've had, and then I'll stop, because we've had a certain amount of success. We've done some very creative things. We've been doing stuff around the commodification of transit that's been interesting. We've been making some inroads into the public sector, but we found a number of problems that we really have to deal with. One is that we were very cautious because we weren't a party, so we brought together a lot of people who didn't have a common line. And because we wanted to keep things together, we were very cautious about not getting into sharp debates. And that was a problem. It meant that we couldn't actually develop politically because we weren't having those kinds of debates. So there's always this question of when's the right time to have those debates, and I'm becoming more convinced that we should have them sooner rather than later. A second problem is that at a moment when the labor movement isn't in struggle, it's hard for us to actually do things to get into the labor movement. We can't invent struggles. If workers aren't fighting, there's nothing, we can't just jump in and support them. Where they're fighting, we can try to find creative ways of supporting them, for engaging them and extending the nature of the struggle, but that's made it especially difficult. And the third problem, which is very difficult, but it's just a question of learning over time, is we simply didn't have the organizational capacities to do this. There's been this, there's a generation of the 60s, and then there's a generation of young people. There's been almost nothing in between of people who learned from an earlier generation and moved on. And that earlier generation, I think, has been learning. It's been doing a lot of things. And it's kind of a mixed bag, but I've been finding that a lot of the people who've been going through the Occupy and the anti-war movement earlier, they're actually thinking. There's a lot of people on the left who write off anarchists, the Wobblies, and my experience is that a lot of them are actually thinking about their own mistakes and learning, and we desperately need them. You will not find these kinds of cores of activists generally in the trade union movement. They're an exception, and developing them is also going to have to depend on people who have feet inside and outside the labor movement and who have that kind of experience in the movements as well. Thank you.
Stephen Aaron Farmer, be next.
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been really a wonderful conference. And how should I say it? I certainly agree with almost everything that my comrades here have said. And usually when I speak, it's about institutional obstacles to revolutionary change, especially with regard to the Middle East. But today I'm going to take the opportunity to speak a little bit about utopia, because it doesn't seem to me anybody's spoken about utopia. There are very few concepts, I think, that are as difficult and as complicated as utopia. And every political attempt to define it is inherently impoverished. In short, utopia isn't a political category in the first place. And I want to note two things before I go further. One, I think this means it's a fundamental mistake to believe that you can translate utopia into practice at all. And the second thing is that at the same time, utopia from the left should not be used as an excuse not to do anything in the present. The perfect shouldn't become an enemy of the good. Each civilization has its own notion of utopia. To think that any of us and any movement anywhere can actualize utopia is already, you could argue, ethnocentric, racist, sexist, etc. The older descriptions of utopia and some new ones all have a pastoral quality, like the Garden of Eden or Paradise, which was once identified with gardens in Persepolis in Shiraz. There's the idea of a land of milk and honey, and there's a garden for the rich in the great movie Metropolis. The point is, we begin with the idea of what we want. Each civilization has its unique utopian images and hopes from which, given the creation of a cosmopolitan sensibility, which hasn't really been discussed either, every other civilization should be able to learn something. Utopian traces, or what Hans Bloch called anticipatory longings, exist in the most various forms of art, philosophy, and religion. In fact, in most forms of human creativity. They provide insight into what humanity might truly want or not want, and so give utopia its substance. Utopia is not about either the conquest of scarcity or any particular institutional form to bring it about. In the first instance, utopia is a matter, I think, of not only discovery, but recovery. In short, it presupposes that we engage in a boldness of the imagination to think about what can shape our activity in some very indirect way, and a knowledge of the past and the cultural heritage that goes with it. Man doesn't live alone, especially when he doesn't have any. He doesn't live by bread alone, especially when he doesn't have any. Utopias always appeal to the wretched of the earth. They understand the liberating character of what Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, termed the right to be lazy, and the longing for not to go to endless meetings and some idiotic and anachronistic idea of workers' control, but rather a beautiful life marked by calm, health, joy, and play. That's what happiness is about. Happiness is not about working. It's about not working. And so we right away find something very evident, that every mass movement that I know of that stemmed from the labor movement has had one thing in common, whatever its other differences, which is shortening the work week. Attempting to achieve radical change through outside existing channels of power is not inevitably utopian. It can simply be foolish and wrong-headed. To consider a Green Party, any party, in power as utopian is absurd. Any party, whether it's Jill Stein's party, or it's Ralph Nader's party, or it's Obama, whatever you want, any party must make compromises once it becomes an establishmentarian party. Just look at Germany and the Greens. Idealism and naivete are not commensurate with utopia. And to think so is, I think, basically foolish. Utopia is an anthropological element. It goes back to the beginnings of civilization. And so the idea of an apocalyptic rupture with what is doesn't work either. Utopia speaks to both reform and revolution. It must. Why would the revolution is fairly obvious, but the reform is perhaps more important. It always retains an element of reform because it's never finished. The society that views itself as finished, as a finished utopia, or even firmly on the path of utopia in theory and praxis, is, in my opinion, dysutopian by definition. Employed critically, the concept of utopia keeps us open to what were previously unacknowledged forms of oppression and the liberating response to them. It could be sexism, it could be racism, it could be homophobia. These are all pre-capitalist phenomena. As Brecht put the matter in his own utopian play, Mahagoni, there's always something missing. And we have to begin with that assumption. So, in the questions that I was given, there was a quote from Lisa Kolakowski about movements having a total program. A total program is nonsense. It never existed, even with regard to Mao or the Nazis, and it can't exist. By the same token, because there's always something missing. By the same token, in his classic Ideology and Utopia, Karl Mannheim noted how every genuine mass movement has been fueled by utopian impulses. That's true even of social democracy. The best-selling book at the end of the 19th century in the United States, after the Bible, was Looking Backwards, by Edward Bellamy, which was a type of social democratic utopia. Utopia can help mobilize the movement, if you want. But at the same time, each utopian attempt to mobilize the movement immediately entangles the idea with particular interests of the class base. A partial view of utopia is inherently introduced by every political organization and substituted for a vision consonant with multiplicity and complexity. In short, utopia in the hands of a movement, and especially a movement without institutional accountability, I disagree with Macri completely, is doomed to become ideology, at least in my view. That's one reason we can't actualize it. The second reason is a more practical one. History doesn't move in some linear fashion. The fact of the matter is that progress in one area of society can occur while regression takes place in another. The simplest example is this: from the 1950s to today, there's obviously been an expansion of cultural freedom for individuals in terms of intermarriage, recognition of homosexuality, and all the stuff that you know. That happened. To deny that that happened, I think, is silly. I got beat up in the 50s for having a Puerto Rican girlfriend. By the same token, as this cultural progress has developed, in terms of class forms, and here I think Sam's completely right, we've seen complete regression and an upward shifting of wealth like we've never seen in the history of the United States. The two can go together. So, if we look at it that way, contradictions from one period are not necessarily resolved before a new period arises. Sexism, racism, homophobia are all examples of what I'm talking about. They were pre-capitalist phenomena carried over into a capitalist period and given a new function. Ernst Bloch called these non-synchronous contradictions. And to deal with them is a matter of crucial import. The idea that, if you want to put it this way, utopia is non-political, I think occurs simply because in the 20th century, the real utopian visions occurred elsewhere, namely in 20th century modernism, which was completely infused with the idea of a new man, but had substance to what it was talking about, in contrast to most of us, and certainly me. They projected new ways of hearing, Schoenberg, new ways of seeing, somebody like Picasso, and new ways of portraying the world, babble about the councils of 1919, 1920. The council, the most impressive council of the post-war era, was the barbarian Soviet. In German, everybody knows that Soviet is called the Soviet of the literati. It's not the Soviet of the communists, certainly not. Utopia is substance. It's longing for something different, different ways of experiencing, different ways of feeling, the hatred of cruelty, new ways of producing. And what we find is that over time, new forms of repression become apparent, and so forth, and so too new prospects for freedom. What do I mean by utopia? I think it's consonant with what my old teacher Henry Pachter said when he wrote, "One cannot have socialism, one is a socialist." If we start thinking that way, we cut away most of the metaphysical stuff that we're engaged in. Socialism is as much a process as freedom and as utopia. So, let me just see where we get here. Anyone who claims to have the secret to utopia, I think, is doomed to demagoguery. And there's something else. There's a kind of moralism which I think has become evident, especially from people who actually have no responsibility for dealing with power in any way. I had to shake the hand of Assad and of Bashir. What did we get out of this? We got some prisoners released in the case of Assad, and I got a very nice abacus too, and an astrolabe. And in the case of Bashir, we repatriated a village, the organization I dealt with. I think it's appalling for anyone to suggest that these kind of reforms don't count or are secondary to the greater vision of revolution or what have you. Revolution is legitimate in my view when grievances can't be heard. And there are cases where that's the case. I don't think that's the case here. And I think that's why you don't have a revolutionary movement here. Just that simple. The United States would have become fascist without the Warren Accord. That was a reality. Every serious movement from below, civil rights movement, feminist movement, used the courts to crystallize their mobilizations. Indeed, and this leads me to the question of councils, because I don't think that goes anywhere either. I once gave a talk in New York, and it was at the Socialist Forum, and luckily there were a lot of people there, and a lot of young people. And I went through my little rap, and a kid raised his hand from the back of the room and said, you know, very nice kid, "Professor Bronner, you know, I like your idea of socialism, but it's not radical enough." So this interested me. So I said, "Well, what then is your idea of socialism?" He said, "It's where everyone controls everything." And I said, "Well, that sounds great, except you better be ready to go to a hell of a lot of meetings." Yeah? Meetings are not fun. That's not what utopia is about, going to some meeting. In fact, the very idea of participatory democracy is anachronistic and not new. It goes back to the beginnings of every revolution. I think we need a new category rather than participatory democracy, which nobody wants to engage in. If you're honest with yourselves, how many of you go to consistently to meetings of your city council? I rest my case. Yeah, this is all taught as a way of avoiding doing anything constructive. And I think what if you wanted to speak about the imagination and transitional stuff, which I certainly agree with, the issue is not participatory democracy. It may not even be participation. This is a notion that comes out of the Middle Ages, for God's sakes, with the free towns. What we need is a notion of accountability in which we're willing to use bureaucracies to check bureaucracies. I don't have the answer for that, but I know that that's the way you're going to go, because this is not the Middle Ages anymore, and the pastoral time is over. We need something different and something new. And it's here that I think that this whole discussion that's taking place, especially with Verso, with someone like Slavoj Žižek calling for the rehabilitation of lost causes without figuring out why they were lost, or Alain Badiou talking about a communist hypothesis. What the hell is that? Marx did not set up, Marx's entire discussion of communism in 40 volumes comes to about 10 pages, if that. He never described it. Communism was a condition in which people are able to take control of their lives or not without being affected by economic interests from the outside. The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. In short, it's an enhanced individualism. What progressive politics is about, and we don't talk about that, is an expansion of possibilities for all individuals. People don't want to work, shorten the work week, expand vacation time. Is that utopia? No. Is it informed by a utopian impulse? Yes. We want better health. Not health care, health. Health care may help. Is that utopia? No. Is it a utopian impulse? Yes. You go into a hospital, you find grayness all over. How about a little, which by the way is exactly what you found in the communist world in the 50s, 60s, in the age of Brezhnev, socialism of gray. That's not what utopia is about. Put some goddamn pictures on the wall. Yeah? Make people feel better. That's what it's about. Indeed, abstract utopian images that you want to translate, abstract imperatives, they don't go anywhere. Tell me make a revolution. What are you talking about? I mean, really, what are you talking about? You saw it here, activist young people, and nobody goes to a city council meeting. I mean, please, who are you going to make the revolution with? And for my friends who are in smaller parties and so on, maybe you want to consider why it is that the party's so small. Maybe it's because you have nothing to tell people. And it's time for us, I think, to change our general look. You want a utopian vision? I'll give you a utopian vision to close up. This is the closing words of Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. And this is the imaginary communist future. He wrote this while he was riding around Russia in his train, organizing the Red Army. Here's what he wrote. Man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic. The average human type will raise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above this ridge, new peaks will rise. That's utopia.
Okay, I was invited to this conference a bit late, and my comments are directed mostly towards what I was able to gather from reading Platypus and reading the questions and trying to get a sense of the environment in which this conference is being posed. I should say, I found a lot of the things that Roger Rashi and Sam Gibb were saying to be really interesting, but this is sort of kind of a directed at Platypus and at the questions that were asked. Okay, so we've heard the term the left used a lot in this conference and in the questions posed for the plenary. We in endnotes think that this is kind of an ambiguous concept. It is all too easy to fall into an idealist interpretation of what that concept means, the left. In the Leszek-Kolakowski text, the left becomes, quote, an eternal idea, or, quote, a spontaneous moral position. He turns a loosely defined concept into a sweeping transhistorical principle, and thus falls prey to a formalistic conception of history. We want to put some flesh on this, some historical flesh on this concept. In essence, we think there have been two broad ways that the left has been employed in the 20th century, in a social democratic and a Leninist conception. They're both ambiguous, and Platypus seems to use the term in both senses, making it doubly ambiguous. Like many formalisms, the contemporary idea of the left can be traced back to the French Revolution. Yet, for most of the 19th century, the term was restricted in its usage. It referred to a political grouping within Parliament. We know that this is how Marx actually used the term, and he did not use it affirmatively, as far as I can tell. Of course, there is something essentially formal about the notion of the left in this sense, for parliamentary democracies tend to divide along a continuum and around a battle for the center. The idea of the left as something beyond Parliament was associated, first of all, with social democracy itself as a project. Social democrats projected the idea of the left out onto the population, onto that part of the population that made up its base, its constituency. The social democratic parties reached out to that constituency, building party machines, affiliating with unions or churches, etc. Thus, the term came to encompass not only a voting bloc, but also a variety of organizations, and that's reflected in the way the term is used today. On the other hand, we have a Leninist conception of the left. By Leninists, we do not refer to Lenin himself, but rather to the ideology that emerged around or in response to his activity that was developed in the 30s and 40s. The Leninist conception refers to the same basic demographic, unions, religious progressives, NGOs, under different names, political parties, activists, intellectual sympathizers, etc. The difference between the Leninist conception and the social democratic one is that the latter, the social democrats, have a purely affirmative notion of this collectivity, whereas the Leninists tend to be more ambivalent. They see the left as an area for recruitment, a sea to go fishing in, but also an area that has potential to give rise to future betrayals. For that very reason, the left must be treated with care. It must be manipulated at times, as in the example of the United Front strategy. The left is the potential source of the party's strength, but also of its defeat. As such, the left remains, for Leninists, the fundamental psychic object, a troubled object, and a bad object. So, why are these two notions of the left problematic? Platypus seems to be saying, there was a time when the left really mattered, that time is no longer. The left is a corpse. We need to breathe new life into it. We want to say, there was never a time when the left really mattered. What mattered was something else, the workers' movement. The concept of the left provided social democrats and Leninists with a way to resolve, ideally or ideationally, what were in fact the real limits that the workers' movement confronted. On the one hand, the concept of the left allowed social democrats to expand their constituency beyond the working class. That became necessary because, in fact, the workers never achieved a majority status in any country with the exception of Belgium. The social democrats found that they were unable to take power as the party of workers. So instead they said, we're the party of solidarity, of equality, progress, etc., of workers plus. It was a matter of diluting ideas to generate parliamentary majorities. For the Bolsheviks, that was precisely the Social Democrats' opportunism, their betrayal of the class. By contrast, or in direct contrast, the concept of the left allowed Leninists to put forward a theory of betrayal, and therefore to justify their specific practice, the attempt to form a disciplined party as the party that is defined by the fact that it will not or does not betray the class. Instead of asking questions about the dynamics and limits of class struggle, the concept of the left allowed Leninists to say, the class was ready, but the left was not. The left betrayed the class. The question of strategy moves to the center, displacing the problem of the absent working class majority. But here, strategy came to refer less to the relationship between the party and the class, and more to a strategy of internal party organization, a strategy in relation to the left, either to ensure that it does not betray, as in a kind of a popular front strategy, or precisely to provoke its betrayal in a way that others can recognize, as in the United Front strategy. Given this brief summary, we prevent our intervention at the level of a kind of therapeutic purging, or a catharsis of sorts. We plead with you to let go of the bad object, the fantasy object, and instead to grasp the real object, the forgotten object. The concept of the left functions as a means of suppressing class analysis. That comes through very clearly, we think, in Platypus's own self-conception. The Platypus Society knows that a great distance separates us from the tradition of the left, but it lacks a theory that can really explain that distance. The reason Platypus cannot answer their own question, which is posed implicitly, why is the left dead, is that the question is posed at the wrong level. In fact, if the left is dead, that is merely a consequence, and we might even say a logical consequence of this other thing, the key thing, that the workers' movement, as it presented itself in the 20th century, is over. Why did this workers' movement end? It cannot be explained, as Platypus seems to do, by transmuting that story into one about oscillations within the left, between pro-organizational and anti-organizational moments, between a good Bolshevism and a bad anti-Bolshevist reaction. The real story, the story of the rise and fall of the workers' movement, is a story about industrialization. In its origins, this industrial working class formed a historically new class. On the one hand, this new class confronted the real problem of acclimatizing itself to dangerous conditions of life and work in urban zones. On the other hand, in newly constructed liberal states, workers faced the hatred of their social betters, both the aristocracy and the upstart bourgeoisie, who meant to exclude them from the polity. It was in response to these twin problems that the workers' movement was formed, a movement that sought to acclimatize workers to their conditions via an affirmation of their identity, their dignity as workers, and that was expressed in a proliferation of a massive number of workers' organizations that weren't only organizations in the workplace, but also all kinds of societies for like raising pigs and choirs and all this kind of stuff. Capitalism, but of course the workers' movement was not only a matter of acclimatization. Capitalism seemed to be fashioning an army of workers disciplined by the factory and thus uniquely fit to govern society. The aggregation of workers in industrial cities gave socialists the sense that one day they would be the majority. It was this idea, more than any other, that framed the revolutionary horizon of the workers' movement. The organizations that the workers built for their defense within capitalism were supposed to function as the basis of future societies. But in fact, it was always either too early or too late for the workers' movement. On the one hand, the rate of growth of the industrial working class tended to decelerate over time. A heavy remainder of peasants and shopkeepers, and even the petty bourgeois capitalists, seemed to suggest that the time of the revolution had not yet arrived. That raised fundamental questions for revolutionary strategy, which I've discussed very briefly above. On the other hand, when this remainder of historically moribund classes did finally enter into dissolution in the second half of the 20th century, the industrial working class was itself already going into decline. First, relative to the labor force as a whole, and then absolutely. This is the key point for us. Deindustrialization spelled the end of the workers' movement, first in the high-income countries in the 1970s, and then in the low-income countries in the 1980s. Workers' movements appeared in South Africa, South Korea, and Brazil, for example, in the 1970s, but now all present the same form, social democracy in retreat. In essence, as more and more factories came online in more and more countries, and as those factories became ever more productive, a generalized commodity glut set in. The onset of this glut was signaled by a long-term decline in industrial profit rates starting in the early 1970s. As a result, a surplus of workers and capital swelled into existence. Jobs became scarce even as goods became superabundant. Under these conditions, it became both possible to attack workers' material existence and necessary to do so, since competition was intensifying everywhere. Thus, under attack, nationally situated workers' movements found themselves unable to score the material gains that had been their last reason for existence. But the fact that the workers no longer affirm their identity as workers is not only a matter of stagnant wages and worsening working conditions. This change in the class relation has been accompanied by a transformation in the composition of the class. An industrial workforce was formerly engaged in building the modern world, and that in a very real sense. It could understand its work as having a purpose beyond the reproduction of capital. All of that now seems ridiculous to many people, and for good reason. The industrial workforce is shrinking. The oil, automobile, industrial complex is not building the world, but rather rapidly destroying it. And everywhere, the working class is less homogeneous, is more stratified and more precarious. More and more workers are stuck in dead-end service jobs, are unemployed, or have been forced into a vast underworld of informal employment in global slums. What remains of the workers' movement today, as far as I can tell, are unions that manage the slow bleed out of stable employment, social democratic parties that implement austerity measures when conservative parties fail to do so, and communist and anarchist sects that are quite small and that wait in the wings for their chance to rush the stage. These organizations have not been completely consigned to the dustbin of history, but none is likely to rejuvenate itself on the world scale. The workers' movement is no longer a force with the potential to remake the world. Yet, and we emphasize this point, the end of the workers' movement is not the same thing as the end of either capital or the working class. Even as more and more workers are rendered superfluous to the needs of capital today, the relation between these two terms continues to define the terms of social life, the terms of what is a life worth living. Indeed, the class relation has only become more dominant since the end of the workers' movement. What has changed is that the diverse fractions of the class no longer shape themselves into a workers' movement. Failing to see this real material basis for the death of the left, Platypus is helpless to explain the character of class struggle over the past decade and a half. Platypus attempts to read anti-globalization or the Occupy movement as part of a continuous history of pro-Bolshevik and anti-Bolshevik swings within leftism. That perspective covers over completely the real gap that separates the present from the past. In the present conditions, the working class is fundamentally fragmented and internally segregated. Moreover, that fragmentation is often desired, directly willed, by fractions of the class, which prefer not to wait until after the revolution for their needs to be addressed. Under these conditions, workers are only able to find a common interest through the extroversion of class belonging into some other weaker form of affirmable shared existence, as citizens, for example, or as the 99%, as we saw recently, etc. This is not merely a matter of ideologically weak leftism. It is an internal limit of class struggle, which finds its basis in the changed material conditions of the class, given first in deindustrialization, and second in a corresponding growth of what Marx called surplus capital alongside surplus population. So what is there left to say? If we are correct at all about the self-undermining nature of capitalist class relations, then we can expect something like the following. In spite of the weakness of class unity, exchange relations will continue to break down. Workers will find themselves put at risk. They will find their lives interrupted or derailed. They will be forced to fight, to organize creatively, to struggle within their conditions against those conditions. Establishing direct access to means of existence outside of the wage and outside of the money form in a multiplicity of different ways will be the only real solution to this problem. But that is not to say that workers will not try many other solutions. For example, they will organize as specific class fractions arrayed against one another, etc. Communism will only become possible when a large fraction of the working class breaks with prevailing forms of struggle and tries instead to destroy the very foundations of capitalist class relations, to really unify humanity outside of the constraints of those relations. What that will look like is more or less impossible for us to imagine today, except in its merest inklings, since it will depend on the particular forms of organization that the class creates and the particular impasses that the class confronts in the course of a proliferating struggle. That is not to say that world revolution is inevitable. Far from it. It is merely to point out what we might call the minimal conditions of its success. The conditions for revolution will emerge not from within the internal development of the left, but rather from the development of a historically specific form or historically specific forms of class struggle. The limits to class struggle, class belonging as an external constraint, are a direct expression of the form of the class relation today in the era of its breakdown. These limits are not merely a matter of bad ideas. They're not a matter of bad ideas. They're not a matter of bad ideas. Attempts to renew the left, absent an intensification of class struggle, are bound to fail. All that project can achieve, it seems, is to attract students for a few years, to do reading groups, and then move on with their lives. No intellectual milieu can survive in the absence of a real movement of the class. According to Gilles Dauvet, who's a kind of a French communist, or is a French communist, alive today, if Luxembourg was the author of the formula, quote, after August 4th, 1914, social democracy is nothing but a nauseating corpse, then in the years that followed, she proved to be quite the necrophiliac. Instead of following in Luxemburg's footsteps, trying to build a society of affiliated necrophiliacs, what is there to do? A lot of people in the audience, as far as I can see, are students or young workers. You don't have the time or the luxury to prepare for the crisis. Austerity and rising youth unemployment affect you right now. There is nothing to do but fight now for whatever future you hope to save, to risk yourself in struggle as it really presents itself today, and thus to experience the actual limits that all such struggles confront in attempting to coordinate disruptive activity across sectors of the class. If this coordination depended merely on getting ideas right, we'd all be doomed.
I have a way of conclusion. Richard Rubin will make some responses. Remarks.
Well, first of all, I don't really recognize platypus in that description. And I think that if it were just a matter of sort of the economics of deindustrialization with the problem, I mean, there are millions of industrial workers in the world. It's a very small percentage of them are any type of Marxist. So I don't think that the problem is, an objective material problem. But I wanted to go back to the questions. First of all, I was put on this panel rather late, so I didn't particularly prepare for it. I am the platypus representative, which is sort of an awkward role, because platypus is hosting the conversation and I am intervening in it. I wanted to say, first of all, that, so when I was put on the panel, to some extent it was suggested to me that my role was to ventriloquize Orthodox Trotskyism, I think was the phrase that was used. And since I'm not an Orthodox Trotskyist, I only do that to some extent. But I do tend to have sympathy for old ideas and tend to believe that the problems of the left are not going to be solved by the endless appeal to new ideas. So I'm somewhat defender of old ideas here. Now, the questions as they were formulated, actually the tension between program and utopia is not one that I would identify with. And it's very much, to me, somewhat platypus speak, and it sort of seems to make a statement rather than necessarily opening up the question. I don't think that the tension between program and utopia is the fundamental problem. So to defend an old idea, a very basic old idea, I think that the problem of humanity over the next generation or so, I don't think there's that much time, is to abolish capitalism on a world scale or a horrible fate will ensue. I think that that's a matter of the objective survival of the species. I think that the basic ideas for that are, again, old ideas. That they're basically, I think that the problem is that the old ideas, the political ideas of the early 20th century have become obscure and difficult for people to connect with. So I'm here as the laudator temporis acti. I guess to go back to what I found interesting, particularly Stephen Eric Bronner's presentation of the question of utopia, and I noticed you cited Ernst Bloch, and I like very much. It's true that there are certainly utopian ideas, say, in all civilizations of a certain sort, in terms of the Hebrew Psalms and utopian longing. But I don't think that utopia really has existed in all civilizations. I think it's really a modern idea. I think in that sense that the publication of the book Utopia in 1516 or whatever actually speaks to something different from the longing for a better world. I think that utopia is something different from heaven, because utopia is imagined still as a place on earth, which is a different and basically secular imagination from the religious aspiration. And I mean, to link up the question of the totality of humanity, I mean, it's interesting to me that the Utopia was published in 1516, and the first circumnavigation of the planet, the first time human beings actually went around the whole planet, was just a few years later. And I think that speaks to a certain movement in modernity, though the actual book was not necessarily something. I guess the other thing that I was thinking about, and I'll probably keep this fairly brief, is I have a feeling when people talk about utopia, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea of utopia, that utopia often functions as, and this presentation of utopia as a kind of not radical conception. And so I had two thoughts that kind of popped into my head when I was thinking about this. And one of this led to Palestine, and the other led to beer. Explain that. Some odd chain of association.
It's obvious, you don't have to explain.
So, Palestine, which is an issue that I've been very familiar with, so one of the things I've noticed in recent years, and I'm not talking about the merits of the case, about one-state politics versus two-state politics. So you meet a lot of, one-state politics obviously have right-wing forms too. Hamas, right-wing Zionists are one-staters too, but that's not what I'm talking about. But the sort of left-wing discussion about one state has shifted in recent years. It used to be a kind of part of a radical program. And now I'll meet like lots of sort of ordinary Jewish people who used to support, say, two states, and now say, well, now I support one state. And you ask them, and I'm not talking about whether one state makes sense or not, or I'm not talking about the merits of one state, but it's the reason why they support it that strikes me, which is people say, I no longer believe that a two-state solution is possible. And I remember Norman Finkelstein, saying, frankly, well, why do you ask for the impossible if you can't get the very hard? And what's striking to me is that this logic, okay, and people will say that they're in effect asking for something that they themselves consider impossible. So you have like a lot of people, and this is something that I see a lot on the left, that utopian thinking becomes a substitute, often it feels to me, for a kind of frustrated reformism. And so that there's, and I felt that around Occupy. I mean, I remember there was a panel that I was on, in fact, you were invited to, that could make, in Philadelphia, and I remember saying, well, Occupy is bound to fail, and the question is what lessons we learn from it. And yet people looked at me and I was saying, well, how do you expect that a bunch of people standing in Zuccotti Park are going to transform global capitalism? I mean, you don't have to think very hard, and in fact, it sort of disintegrated much faster than I expected. And I think that the utopianism that was being defended around Occupy came from a feeling that we wasn't even going to get very limited reform. There's a kind of weird emotional psychology around utopianism and the role it plays, particularly on the left today, that feels to me about a disappointed reformism, that people find it difficult to imagine even minimal reforms, and therefore it's the sense of, well, let's demand the impossible, or what they themselves feel is impossible. And by the way, I don't believe, and when I said about it, for example, about the one state, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that when it's formulated in the rhetoric of liberalism. So it's no longer formulated in the rhetoric of joint socialist struggle. It's formulated as one liberal binational state. And the other thing was like this sign I saw, this stupid sign, which was in an airport the other day. And it was this guy, cheerful, blonde guy with this big mug of beer, and he said, I believe that beer will change the world. I don't know how, but I believe that beer will change the world. And I often feel that about a lot of the left. I feel like there's a sense of, okay, activism is going to, or struggle is going to change the world. And looking at the longue durée of the question of socialism, which, I don't think we have a choice but in some sense or other to raise the question and to struggle for it, the problem has been, the question was raised about social democracy and Stalinism, or social democracy and Leninism. The problem has been that we have examples of two negative examples of socialism. We have examples of social democratic parties that betray their socialist principles. And we have the example of revolutions basically in backward parts of the capitalist world that break with capitalism in certain ways but didn't yield a society that most of us would find, I mean, and I would defend the Bolshevik Revolution, but didn't yield a society that feels really genuinely emancipated. It certainly wasn't even living up to the standards of bourgeois democracy. And therefore, to pose the idea, which I think has to be posed, that of what is needed for humanity to survive is, I would claim, and this is a very old idea, and I think there are really very few new ideas on the left, probably none in the last 70 years or so, a world socialist revolution, and it has to be one that takes power in advanced capitalist countries like the United States. And so the question has to be raised, is that a possibility? And is that something one is going to put on the agenda? And there are many people will say, no, that's not a realistic goal. And to struggle for that goal is hopeless. And therefore, what one ends up with, I think, is social democracy. So, or patterns of thinking about the left that feel to me like evasion. So I haven't been particularly coherent, but I'll leave it at that.
I'd like to give each of the speakers a chance to respond to each other. We can go in the same order that they spoke in the first place. Hopefully we can bring some points of connection between the different talks, which were somewhat divergent and perhaps broke down in some senses around, whether they chose to address some of the programmatic tasks they felt themselves embracing, or whether they were addressing the level of, the question of utopia. So hopefully we can get the speakers to kind of, very much address the other panelists' remarks.
Yeah, I'll try and go first and say that I found the panel extremely interesting, and I would have comments and disagreements with practically everyone, but it's difficult to do that in a short answer. Very quickly, for Steve Conrad here, I found it interesting that he picked up Marx's definition of socialism, which is the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. I think this is a great quote, but I believe it comes straight out of the French utopian socialism. It is a formulation that you find practically verbatim in Fourier and in Cabet, who were both utopian communists. So I don't think you can avoid the discussion of Marx's attempt to combine utopian socialism with political socialism in a program. But I am very interested in the way you have framed the limits of utopia, and utopia being more of an anthropological category than a political category. But there is a question that I have regarding what you said. I'd like to address a couple of remarks to Sam, and deal with the notion that he's raised of this intermediate form of organization. I've seen it emerge twice. I was engaged in it myself during the 70s. As we were building a new communist movement, which was essentially Marxist Maoist. A lot of us left the halls of academia at the time and went to work in factories. The initial form of organization that we could do was exactly that, an intermediate form of organization, where we would try to get workers around the issue of producing a factory paper, getting involved with the union, beginning to study socialism. And I think this form of organization, as I lived through it in the 70s, was part and parcel of a rising wave of struggle in the working class and labor movement. Can this be sustained at a time when the labor movement is declining and is facing crisis? I think it's an interesting question, and I can't answer immediately, but I think that's a good question to pose. Secondly, I've seen something similar emerge last year in Quebec, and that is a following very interesting contradiction. Radical professors who wanted to support the student movement decided not to do it through their trade union organization and set up a group called Professors That Support Free Tuition and engage constantly in massive mobilization alongside the students. And what was funny about this particular form of organization, that they were practically all militant trade unions. And many of them were actually sympathizers and members of the next there. But that they felt in some way that within the trade union structure of today, there was no way they could bring the trade union to support the mass movement, because that would open up the trade union to massive repression and massive fines, and go back to destroy. So the question that some of these activists are posing today is this: if the trade union cannot be an arena of mobilization and support for massive movements such as the student strike, then what is the use of the trade union movement today? And yet you have another type of reaction from some of the leaders in the trade union movement to say, well, we have to bring this form of militancy back in the trade union, because if all activists are part of this intermediate organization, how the hell are you going to renew the movement? So it's an interesting kind of debate with the workers' assemblies that you're putting forward. Now, I don't want to focus the debate only on that. It's just to say that those are interesting ideas. I think it's essential to put them into practice and see how they evolve and what they bear in terms of either political fruits or fruits in transforming the trade unions. That's it. Thank you very much.
I just want to address two things, really. One is what Rashi just raised about assemblies. And I don't see assemblies as a substitute for unions, but I do see them as a space to do things that unions are not doing, and to have the kind of discussions and strategic things that aren't happening in unions, some of which may be brought back into the union. Some of which may reform unions, but not make them into revolutionary organizations. Unions are going to represent their members. But they might represent them more effectively if they could be informed by a broader class analysis. And I do think that in places like Wisconsin, which once it was over, it just ended. The question is, why wasn't there an assembly where people could keep meeting to talk about how do you sustain this? How do you sustain the struggle? One of the interesting things in Quebec itself was a number of communities actually began to mimic what the students were doing in assemblies and formed assemblies in their own spaces, so it's interesting. I found this just very interesting. I just want to comment on one thing, which I think is what you raised. I mean, what do you do? What do you do when you look out there and you say the possibility of being successful in terms of fighting for socialism is incredibly small? I guess it's a philosophical question. My only response to it is, I don't know what else to do. In other words, I guess I live my life not telling people that socialism is inevitable if you just do the right thing. I guess I live it acting as if my hypothesis is that it's possible. And I treat it as a hypothesis. It might not be. And therefore I try to live my life as if it is possible. And I don't know what else we can do. I can't promise anybody or guarantee or prove them anything more than that. And it's a choice to be made. Some people will say, boy, if the chances are 1 in 1,000, it's not worth my effort. And some people will say, chances are 1 in 1,000. That's pretty terrific.
I think Sam hit the nail on the head. If I can just respond for a moment to Roger, the utopian program link that Marx saw, I think, was predicated on a fundamental teleological outlook. Now, I don't think that teleology holds anymore. Now, if it doesn't hold anymore, then I think Sam's position is the only one you can take, and that's what Sam's just described is very much how I saw Utopia, which is as a regulative ideal. Wilhelm Liebknecht, the daddy of Karl Liebknecht, who was, of course, the martyr with Rosa Luxemburg, he was a great activist, and he came out with a very interesting line. Somebody asked him to justify his belief in socialism. And his answer was, I can see the future appearing as present. I don't think anybody can make that argument anymore. And if you can't make that argument, then I think you have to you wind up being a socialist because you think it's the right thing to do, not because you're sure it's going to occur. With regard to, and what that means is, whether you choose to reform or you choose a revolution, there has to be some fundamental connection between means and ends. Now, the ultra-left has always demanded an absolute connection between means and ends. In other words, you prefigure the future and the present. Marcuse exploded that idea. He said that the people who want to bring about a new sensibility already have to have it before they bring it about. I don't think that'll go either. So it seems to me, instead of demanding the absolute connection between means and ends, which basically means you're already in utopia, the ethic for the socialist revolution, what you're driven back to is demanding a plausible connection between means and ends. And that is something that I think has to be talked about. Because as soon as one says the end justifies the means, the question becomes, without a teleology, what justifies the end? And the only answer you have is the means you use to achieve it. And that, to me, is the key issue. We have to, ethics means that you're recognizing limits on what you can do and and how you justify your actions. That's at least the way I would begin. As far as the world revolution, Brecht's teacher was called Horsch. And he had a beautiful set of poems which he dedicated to his teacher, called the cow-shaped poems. And Horsch was a man of the ultra-left. And Brecht starts out and he says, yes, my old teacher, he was a wonderful man, wise man. And he said to the world, it's a choice between all or nothing. To which the world responded, well, if that's the choice, then better nothing. And I think that's where we are. I don't think this will go either. So those are my responses.
Richard, if you could let Aaron do his.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I have to say that I'm sure that, there would be a lot of disagreements between me and Roger on the one hand and Sam on the other hand, but I think that what I share in common with them is a kind of sense that you have, especially Roger in the context of this, of what's happening in Quebec, you have this emergent, very vibrant, social struggles that are appearing. And those struggles are giving rise to questions, on the one hand, of a kind of tactics that in the Quebec student movement spread, as far as I understand, quite rapidly across many schools, without the pre-existence of a kind of massive revolutionary organization. That kind of rapid spread of new tactics or kind of something that works gives rise, to organizational questions of how it might be possible in our times to kind of coordinate and extend that disruptive activity. And I think that, that's the kind of situation that we're going to find ourselves in. I think that there's a way that our situation today is very dynamic, and I think that dynamism is given in the capitalist crisis, not just as something that, occurred or started in 2007, 2008, but something that has a longer history. And I'm kind of surprised that the relationship between, on the one hand, kind of programs and utopias in an earlier era and the unfolding long-term decline in profit rates and declining growth rates across the capitalist world, with the exception of China and other parts of the world during different moments. But that long-term global tendency, given in deindustrialization, given in this expansion of surplus populations and surplus capital, it just seems to me that it's very difficult to explain the specificity of those kind of organizational problems, we might say today, without having that in mind. And I think that also you know, it's the key to thinking about this question of utopia and the absence of kind of utopian ideas. I mean, Stephen referred to this idea that, you know, we need to see to have a utopia is about seeing the future appear in the present. And
That wasn't me, that was Liebknecht.
Sorry.
That was Liebknecht.
I'm just saying no, of course. Sorry, I don't mean to misattribute it. But you know, I think that there's a lot of ways that was possible in the context of an earlier workers' movement that's not possible today. You know, we live in a time where it's very difficult to find a term within present-day society, workers' organizations, or even much more generally, some kind of concept of a neutral means of production or technology or science. There's nothing in the present-day society that I think is affirmable as such, and that's like a kind of key feature of our times. And at the same time, it's very difficult in the context of that, when an affirmable term of that kind is absent, you know, a kind of completely affirmable term is absent in that way, it's also difficult to kind of enact a program based on a kind of, you know, on a tendency already existing in society of that sort, that one could imagine, or the workers' movement could imagine, taking state power and then enacting or creating a workers' society.
Sorry, so we can get to the questions and answers.
Okay. I'll start.
Respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond. First of all, I don't think that I'm posing an all or nothing thing, and I also, in terms of affirming, there are lots of reforms that I would support. I think that labor unions are highly supportable institutions. I'm not posing reform or revolution. I'm saying that ultimately, in terms of and not that long into the future, I think that the problem of worldwide socialist revolution is necessary for the survival of humanity, because I don't think that capitalism is a sufficiently stable system that is going to provide anything other than barbarism and perhaps the annihilation of the human species within a not too distant future. And of course, many people already experience barbarism, but I'm saying for those of us who live outside of barbarism. So I don't know if that's possible, and if I think about it objectively, I would have to say the odds are in favor of barbarism, not socialism. But obviously, one has to, in some sense, struggle for that, and I'm not counterposing reform revolution. And I also think that if you say that sort of you can only be a socialist but can't have socialism, essentially if you write off the traditional aspiration of Marxism as utopian, then you're really writing off the whole Marxist tradition. I mean, and I don't think that the problem here about Marxism needs of struggle is really some objective matter of economic transformation. I mean, I think that, for example, the way people think about Leninism has everything to do with the experience of Stalinism. I don't think that I think it has to do, the way people think now about it is different from the 80s because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are a lot of conjunctural factors that are ideological. The way people in this room who are in their early 20s think about it is very different because they've lived through a different set of experience than from me in my 40s. So I think that there is a large element of ideological autonomy. In fact, fundamentally, I think that if humanity dies or plunges into barbarism, the problem will be fundamentally a lack of imagination among enough people of a better future, that something else is possible. I don't think that things can be explained in some sort of materialist terms as are proposed, declining rates of profit. I mean, if there's deindustrialization, if there's austerity, you know, that can result in all sorts of directions. I mean, it could result in people becoming more radicalized. It could result in people becoming fascists. The way people respond to the same economic situation is determined by lots of factors. And one of the things you said about the Liebknecht, I agree that I find it very difficult to imagine socialism or any kind of successful socialist revolution. But I remember meeting older radicals, not radicals of the 60s generation, but radicals of the 30s generation. And I did feel with some of them that they really could, or had at one time, at least in the 30s, really imagined a socialist future.
I agree with that.
And the experience of meeting people who were perfectly sane, who really imagined a socialist future, had a profound effect on me. And there's some part of me that willingly suspends disbelief, then feels a need to willingly suspend disbelief, because that's the only way I can navigate what seems to me objectively necessary. I don't really like radical politics. When we were talking about the assemblies, I was thinking, do most people really want to spend time in these sort of like intermediate organizations? I don't know. I mean, it's a good idea if people really want it. But I think lots of ordinary people, and for that matter, me myself, that don't really want to do politics. I think that
They just want the good stuff.
right, which is insane. Like I think that
Good luck.
that's. Yeah, but I mean, you have to go through politics and political struggle to get to a society, I agree, where you wouldn't have to have politics, or where politics would be a relatively trivial matter. I don't want to participate in all the decisions about economic planning in a socialist society.
Richard, maybe we can move now to questions from the audience. We're running pretty late here, so hopefully everyone will forgive going over. I'd like to at least give us an opportunity to have about 35 minutes of question and answer, which is certainly less than I would have initially hoped for. So, that means that the questions can be kept short and the answers kind of to the point, if possible. It should be possible. Okay, so Monta's going to be taking them as she kind of sees them, because it's a little difficult for me to make out everybody in the audience.
Hi, my name is Corey. I'm a Platypus member. I was actually very glad that someone on the panel cited Trotsky, because I had planned on doing the same, but in a briefer vein. Trotsky said in the transitional program that all talk to the effect that historical conditions have not yet ripened for socialism is the product of ignorance or conscious deception. Not only have they ripened, but they have begun to get somewhat rotten. And that's a quote that all of us, I'm sure, are familiar with.
Speak in the mic, please, because
sure, sorry.
fading in and out.
Sure, sorry. And so my primary question is in the same vein as Trotsky, looking back on the new left of the 60s and 70s, to all the panelists, do you think that the new left succeeded in learning the lessons of the old left, per se, of the kind of second international radicals? And if not, how can we even begin to use the term revolution without learning those lessons? If the new left couldn't learn the lessons of the old left, how can we even begin to measure the shortcomings that we now encounter? And so how can we, as radicals in the present, use the term revolution?
Do any of the speakers like to take that on? Okay, Roger, and then Steve.
Yeah, I think the only way you can use the term revolution is looking at ongoing movements of the world. It's the only way. I mean, revolution cannot be defined in an abstract way. And I think Lenin's definition was fantastic because it brought it down to concrete things. Lenin's definition was, what is revolution? When the people above cannot do what they always do, and the people below do not want to live like they did before. That is the simplest materialist definition of revolution. And I think revolutions are going on in the world. In different ways, in different forms, but in different shapes, they are going on in the world. So it's not an existential question. It's not an abstract question. It's not a philosophical question. If you get your hands dirty and fight in the social movements and with the social movements, you will find that revolution perspectives come out of that. I'll give you an example. I was in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and I was standing in line to pick up the catalog. Right in front of me, there was this little lady dressed in traditional Bolivian garb. I was talking in French to my comrade right next to me, and she turns around and says, "You're French?" I said, "No, I'm Canadian." She says, "No, you're not Canadian, you're Quebecois." I said, "Whoa, how did this little lady dressed in Bolivian garb, obviously came down from a village up in the mountain, know that?" And she said to me, "We have a union in our village, and 5 years ago, as part of Via Campesina's work around the world, I went to Canada and I visited Toronto and I visited Montreal, and I understood what social movements were going on there, and I sympathize with these movements, and I think all our struggles are linked because making revolution is fighting against the existing state of things. And I said, you know, it's true. I think it's the only way we can conceive of revolution today. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe, Stephen, if you would address the historical dimension of Corey's question.
I think E.P. Thompson put it well. He said that the 60s, the New Left was the first movement that placed culture at the center of the enterprise. And I think that's true. It's not so much that the 60s learned from the Second International, the Third International. It's that they provided a critique for something different, something that wasn't acknowledged before. And that's part of the utopian element. I mean, I was going out with somebody who was one of the founders of the women's movement. And she and her friends in New York, Democratic women, did a little demonstration. And Roz's entire apartment, 3 rooms, was filled within a week with letters. At that time, there was no email. Letters from women all over. They touched a nerve. What were considered personal concerns became public concerns. You can think of rape, you can think of incest, you can think of all this kind of stuff. This comes out new. What I think is the utopia, if you want to put it this way, both the practical and the utopian demand right now is, I think you guys have to do to the 60s what the 60s did to the 30s. You have to develop your own idea of what revolution entails. You need your own style. I mean, one of the things with Occupy Wall Street is that struck me was everybody was talking about the great, the imagination and so on. I thought it was the same thing as People's Park, where I was when I was in Berkeley. The look was the same, the music was the same, the slogans were the same, everything's the same, And if I can say so, without being too nasty, I mean, there's been a sort of pandering of the young among leftists. Oh, it's great we have young people here and so on. Well, you young people, do something. I mean, figure out what it is that will make your movement real. I think what Roger said was correct. You want a revolution? Make it. Yeah.
Okay,
make it new.
Unless there's an interest from other panelists to respond to that question, I'd like to move on to the next.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had a question for Aaron, but I think it also might apply to some of the other comments made by panelists. Aaron, I think you raised the issue of what the history of the left, what kind of object is the history of the left for Platypus? And so I wanted to address it and maybe raise the issue of utopia. In that Kolakowski piece that was quoted in the questions given to the panelists, Kolakowski also talks about the left as a fermenting element in history, as a way of pushing developments towards a particular direction. And in terms of the working class movement, I thought the formulation by Lukács, who's really just repeating Marx, of moving from the class in itself, or it's a class for itself, is a move done through the vehicle of political consciousness, historical consciousness, a kind of giving direction to a force. You need the force, I think that we're in agreement there, kind of like the presence of the workers' movement, at least for Lukács, in the early 20th century. But the direction of that force is not given by its very historical appearance. It's actually like a problem of figuring out the what for. So the question, I guess, is what relationship, Aaron, do you think what is the relationship between something like historical consciousness within the workers' movement and the left, and what do we learn from that for the present? How do we make sense of that relationship between historical consciousness and the left and the labor movement? What is it to learn, if at all, for the present?
Can we let him take the question as stated?
I'm sorry?
Can we let him take the question as stated?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you know, I think I tried to, I referred to that maybe in my talk a little bit, but I guess I'll repeat something or add to it a little bit, which is just that I think that the left in the 20th century, or in the early 20th century especially, faced certain kinds of strategic questions, right, that emerged from the way that capitalism and the workers' movement developed in that period, you know, and that those strategic questions were given first and foremost in this problem of like adding up the class, and it had to do with the kind of persistence of the old regime. It had to do with the kind of limits to the growth of the industrial working class in particular, and a number of other things, essentially. And I think that the point that I'm trying to make is just that those conditions and those limits within the workers' movement, that's not our situation today. You know, that's fundamentally not our situation. And the conditions of struggle that are emerging today are quite different because the form of the capitalist class relation is quite different. And the kind of working class. I mean, it's worth talking about this problem of class composition today that, you know, I think that Roger and Sam were really confronting or talking about the confrontation with the problem of the composition of its class, the composition of the class, its fragmentation, the failure of trade unions, the very changed conditions of trade union struggles today, and the continued unfolding of capitalist crisis. In these situations, struggle will take place. Struggle is taking place, and it's giving rise to very specific, and I would maybe somewhat to a greater degree than what Sam and Roger posed, you know, I think that a lot of those organizational questions are very specific to the struggles in the context of their unfolding. It's very difficult outside of participating in those struggles to kind of make claims about what forms of organization will take shape. But I think that the point today is to participate in struggles as they emerge or as they affect us, you know, and to see revolution, the possibilities of revolution emerging out of the limits of class struggle today. That's the fundamental thing, you know, and so to refer to the past, and we do maybe too much talking about the past in endnotes, you know, because I think we live in a transitional period today and the past weighs very heavily on us. But the point is to see our fundamental difference from the past and to engage in struggle today as it presents itself.
Can I make?
Sure.
I think it's very interesting what you raised about Lukács and, you know, rephrasing Marx's thing about the class in itself and the class for itself. Very interesting because Lukács formulated the party as a key mediation, allowing the class to move from class in itself to a class for itself, right? So you have in Lukács a philosophical expression of what Leninism was and its fetishism of the party. You have to call it that. Now, interestingly enough, Lukács was influenced by Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg's answer to that very question was that if you want to move the class from in itself to become a class for itself, it's through class struggle. What can we say about that, and what lessons can we learn for the left today? I think both of these statements are correct. In other words, for the class to become conscious, you have to participate in class struggle and create new political expression, new political parties. But there's got to be a way, a means of having institutional checks on the party. This is where I join Sam's important contribution regarding the Workers' Assembly. You cannot establish a party as the ideal form of organization, the concretization of class consciousness, and therefore give it this papal, incredible power to decide what is good or bad for the class, because as we've seen, parties can betray the revolution, you know? So can we achieve a new understanding of the relationship between movement and parties today? Possibly. I think it's the only way to try and frame the question and have a new relationship between movement and party, where the movement can check and criticize the party, where the party attempts to also unite the various movements, and you engage in an equal exchange, not a hierarchical exchange. If you do not do that, I don't know how you can move eventually towards transforming the system. And that relates to something that you've said. You talk a lot about the decline of the working class movement. I would put that to you, that if you look at the world today in absolute terms of how many workers exist in the world, I would say today you have more working class people than ever in the history. Look at China, for Christ's sake, and the incredible industrialization that's going on in China. You realize that China has 1.3 billion people, of which 52% live in cities today. In other words, close to 700 million people. And they expect that within the next decade, 200 more million people are going to move into the cities. This is the most massive urbanization that we've seen in the history of mankind, or humankind. Now, these people moving massively to the city, 900 million people, what activities will they engage in? I think a massive amount of them will be workers. Workers in industry, workers in service industry. So to say that the workers' movement is in decline, I think is a Western-centric vision of what we've been living through the past few decades. It's not necessarily true on a world scale. And once these new workers in China, in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, undergoing incredible wave of industrialization, when these people begin to develop class consciousness and engage in massive social struggles, I think the question will be posed in a completely different way. Thank you.
Can I actually...
If you can keep it brief, I'd just like to
do you
move
happen
on
to
to
know,
new questions.
do you happen to know, Roger, how many industrial workers there are in China?
Apparently, according to statistics that I've heard, roughly close to 400 million, of which 250 million are illegal workers in the city and considered do not have the permit which allows them to live in the city. So you have a sub-proletarian strata in China, which is super exploited, and which is a condition which allows Chinese capitalists to develop today.
It's the wrong question. I mean, you know, you're almost defining the working class as if it's manufacturing workers. I mean, people who work on construction are making things, they're workers. People who work at retail in Walmart are workers. The workers just, you know, in the United States, the workforce isn't disappearing.
I never said that.
You don't understand that?
No, I said I never said that. I never
Think
said
maybe
that.
the-
Your
maybe the point
definition of
to be
your
clarified.
definition of the industrial workforce declining in numbers is posing the question in a very particular way, that the question of revolution and worker activity depends on the industrial workforce.
I didn't say that. I'm just saying, what I'm saying is that we live in a period where the industrial, I think that it would be strange to say about the 20th century workers movement that it didn't take the figure of the industrial worker and of the progressive nature of industry, the neutral nature of the factory and so on as its key, you know, as a key feature, both in terms of its own utopias and its programs. I mean, that seems to me absolutely clear. I'm not saying that we live in an age where, you know, there's been any decline in the wage relation or in the existence of wage labor. Obviously, we live in a period where that's massively the conditions under which people live. But I think it's strange to not pay attention to the transformation, the composition of the working class. Its composition, i.e. where it works, the kinds of activities that workers are engaged in, the way that workers can or cannot see those activities as being part of building a new world, right? That's the birth of the new within the whole. Those conditions, to
No,
me,
you're absolutely right, but you have to remember that in the 1920s, somebody who worked in an auto plant was considered a precarious worker. Conditions were lousy, turnover was incredible, until they got unionized, there was no reason to stay. So you're absolutely right, we can't analyze what's going on without recognizing the changing composition of the workforce, but I thought you were going, in a fairly mechanical way, from the decline of industrial workers to the decline of revolutionary potential.
Richard, if you're going to make I'm sorry, I have to move on. I want to make sure we can get to another set of questions.
There were more domestic servants in Victorian England than factory workers. I mean, I don't think the question about the industrial worker is really relevant to the question of the function of socialism and whether they're in China. I mean, I think there's two separate issues. I mean, you could have a socialist movement with that, not necessarily based on industrial workers. And the question is, why are industrial workers not socialists?
All right, well, I'm sorry, I know that there's a lot more to, back and forth in responses that could be made, but I'd like to make sure that we can get to another couple of questions before we have to conclude this evening.
I guess what I would say in favor of the concept of the left is that it poses that it poses the question of freedom in a way that no political movement has ever done in history before, and that's what's so important about the concept of the left, as opposed to a valorization, glorification of merely working class struggle. I mean, with that you could end up sort of with a Bernsteinian notion that really what I aim for is really to have the working class have better conditions. Of course, if that's true, then you don't want to have a revolution, because that might probably bring about worse conditions. So that's actually what the concept of the left does for me, in my mind. It poses a problem of freedom in a way that no political movement has ever done before and ever since.
Yeah, that wasn't exactly a question, so I'm not sure if there was a response that any of the panelists, Aaron or others, would like to make.
Well said.
Well said, we can leave it there. Wentai, would you like to move us to the next question?
Hi. So 3 questions, I'll be quick. Sam, I have a question about the GTWA. Just, was it actually socialist or communist, or, like, I'm curious about the political orientation of the organization, or is that what you were sort of referring to when you were saying you didn't have the hard arguments? That was an issue of unclarity about these organizations. To Aaron, I am curious to push a little more on this issue, what you were talking about the sort of reproductive character of the working class, whatever service worker or precarious workers in the US. It does, I mean, I guess this goes back to the panel on Realpolitik today. I mean, it seems to me like people who are in fact no longer obviously sort of making the world heroically, striving to build tall things, but doing like menial things that are clearly unnecessary for anything but the reproduction of this like miserably poorly organized society. Why wouldn't that lead to massive movements for the abolition of work? All of this sounds like
What about nurses?
I mean, that's another story, right? The service worker section or whatever is like a mess. And then the final thing is to Richard. I feel like you did, Richard, avoid a little bit Aaron's challenge to you, which is you said, there's a failure of an imagination of socialism, but why? Like, he tried to provide an explanation, which he thinks is, in large part, seems due to an end of a certain period and a profound change in the character of the class struggle. I'd like to know what your account is better.
Okay, very briefly, I think that Marxism has encountered 2 problems, which in the 20th century, which one might call the German problem and the Russian problem. The German problem is the betrayal of August 1914. It's the way that social democracy showed itself incapable of overthrowing capitalism in the place that previous to 1914 one might have thought it would be most likely to do so. And then the Russian problem is the problem of what happened to the successful, in certain respects, Bolshevik revolution, in the way many aspects of that then became repellent to people who aspired to socialism. I mean, and I could go into the usual narrative, it would be more or less a rehearsal of standard Trotskyist tropes, but I'm not going to get into that. So I think that those are the 2 problems. The problem of mass socialist parties and the developed capitalist parties failed to overthrow capitalism in the place where it was most developed and where Marxists of the 19th and early 20th century would have thought socialism first would have developed. And so the only places that capitalism was overthrown were backward parts of the capitalist world. And you had dictatorships. I mean, you had progressive aspects of that, but you also had dictatorships. And so both of those things have undermined faith profoundly in the possibility for socialism. And then you have other factors that have happened in more recent decades, such as the collapse, again, of the Stalinist regimes. Also a shift in the way the left is thought of. So I mean, sex, drugs, and rock and roll are fine, I'm proof of those. But in general, I don't think that the 60s and the legacy of the 60s, the further we get from them, I think the more problematic it becomes in terms of the way it transformed the left. And I think that the victories of the 60s are mostly in terms of areas like liberal rights. So in other words, you win gay marriage, which is good, obviously I support gay marriage, but then you have the whole issue of neoliberalism, which does not seem to me something fundamentally new, but it seems to me basically neoliberalism is the kind of capitalism you get when you don't really have a left that's capable of challenging it.
Maybe if Sam wants to answer this kind of specific
Yeah,
question.
in terms of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, people on the outside would basically see it as socialist. People on the inside, and socialism isn't such a difficult category to carry in Canada, so it's easy for people to identify themselves as socialists, but mean different things by it. Some people would just identify themselves as anti-capitalists, and people within it who are Marxists are Marxists very openly. They're known as Marxists and socialists.
Aaron, if you wanted to address the last part of the question?
I'm sorry?
Aaron, if you wanted to.
Oh yeah. I think very much that, you know, under the present conditions, groups of people who find themselves making, you know, that they are not building a world but are engaged in nothing more than reproducing class relations, that's fundamentally the situation, you know, that defines a kind of revolutionary possibility today. And maybe I didn't talk about it enough, and so because within our group EndNotes, we think that we're associated with a sort of a larger collective of journals that pose themselves as a kind of milieu around this idea of the revolution as communization, and basically are attempting to think through what the conditions of revolution might be in our period, and how that revolution, which we refer to in a kind of provisional and weak way as communization, what the actual conditions are in class struggle in the present, what the limits are that class struggle confronts in the present moment that might, in the course of an intensifying class struggle, give rise to a revolution. And part of that project right now, in a kind of, I would say, transitional period in a way, in terms of the a kind of early moment in the intensification of class struggle in our period, that has very much a lot to do with. I think that the idea that neoliberalism is to purely be explained in terms of that the absence of the left, I mean, it's almost becomes quite a circular argument. It's strange to, I don't know, I mean, I identify in a lot of ways as a Marxist, and it's strange to be on a panel of Marxists who don't think about the development of the crisis tendencies of capitalism. That seems to me to be an absolutely essential feature of the present, and you know, the reasons why neoliberalism emerges out of a situation of generalized overproduction and, you know, declining rates of growth, intensifying struggles occurring in that context. The point is to think about the specificity of the present, the composition of the class in this moment, the unavailability of the utopias of the past within this moment, and how the specificity of the situation might give rise to a kind of a new revolutionary, a new concept of revolution. And we should be kind of open to that emergence and not just think that the emergence of revolution in the present is about learning the lessons of a past from an era whose fundamental conditions are just totally different than ours, I think. And not totally different from ours, but different from ours in very essential ways.
Maybe we can take one final question. I'm sorry to have to kind of conclude the evening so abruptly, but we are almost half an hour over our initially scheduled kind of conclusion. So we can take one more question and then give a chance for each of the panelists to make some closing remarks, and we'll wrap up.
All right, well, that puts a lot of pressure on me. Thank you. So I guess I tried to tie a couple of things together that I sort of felt all the panelists were addressing. So I mean, one sort of thing that Kolakowski said from this period, from this thing that's being quoted, is utopia is a mysterious consciousness of a real historical movement, which is a very mysterious sounding thing, granted. But I mean, I'd sort of take that to, be kind of Kolakowski remembering or rediscovering, a certain aspect of Marx's thought, which is that, his critique of utopianism or utopian socialism is grappling with the fact that, utopia came out of history. It emerged as a, as part of a kind of political movement, and yet sort of seemed to be posing the possibility of a form of life that seems to be like outside of the possibility of history, like at least in any sort of like narrow sense. And how is that like possible? I mean, you can deal with that in one way by just like dismissing it as like the rantings of like crazy people. But if you're going to actually take it seriously, then you have to sort of ask yourself, how could this thing sort of come out of history and in that sense be part of the material of history, and yet sort of seem to be posing something that's impossible? And, so there's sort of that, I think, sort of problem, and how does one sort of account for that then, like scientifically? And so, in the present, what I think really complicates that is something that Richard brought up, which is that, the slogan in the 60s was, be realistic, demand the impossible. And we're actually now in a period where, like, even the realistic seems impossible. And so, if that's, and yet at the same time, capitalism, continues to be this kind of process of, like, kind of ongoing disintegration that seems like it should be posing certain possibilities for the left. I mean, when you talk about something like, the 70s and like deindustrialization, you're also talking about the dismantling of the welfare state, and that's not simply like something that's being imposed upon the working class and others, and thus something that simply they're going to kind of react to almost like, a twitching, like, like putting like the electrode on the frog's leg or something. Like they're only going to respond to it politically the degree to which it's, like harder for them to eat. But, that with that, there's also a fundamental transformation that's happening. There's in a certain sense, there's a revolution that's happening with that. And that institutions that had existed for decades were being dismantled, were being changed. And, at the same time, this did not seem to be happening in any sort of like emancipatory way, like not in a way that like was improving people's lives. So I mean, I guess that for me, then that poses the problem, like a kind of problem of it's like, well, you can speak of like utopianism, but isn't there a way in which the present is already sort of this kind of, negative utopia or kind of like, negative revolution or kind of non-emancipatory revolution? And if so, then
to kind of conclude those.
Sure. So I mean, I guess my question then would be, I mean, I feel like that then all sort of people here kind of dealing with this, trying to address this question, had a sense in which they were saying that, like there's a problem of like a lack of political clarification of some variety. And so I guess my question would be, if that's the immediate obstacle, what would a politics in the present attempting to address that lack of clarity look like, in your opinion?
Any takers?
I'll just make a quick statement. I think we are living in a period where neoliberalism is in a deep crisis. And in that time of crisis, we see the capitalist classes, the dominant classes, develop new strategies for accumulation of capital and new forms of oppression, domination, exploitation. But at the same time, we see rising new mass struggles, and therefore the potential and the possibility for formulating new strategies and new forms of organization of the subaltern classes, of the dominated, of the people, of the laboring classes, the laboring masses. And I think the key to answer any political question that we have is to look at the concrete struggles developing and what lessons we can learn from them. I'll give you an example. For 3 years in Quebec, in preparing for the student movement, we were trying to craft a strategy which would get labor to launch a general strike. It became impossible to do that because there was no part of the labor movement that was willing to launch a general strike. But the students very correctly said, unless there's a wider mass mobilization, we're going to get correction. What happened is that a wider form of mobilization emerged, not from a general strike, but from massive urban spontaneous demonstrations. And then there's no one that predicted that, and no one inserted that in their strategy, and least of all the students. If you talk to the student leaders, they say, at that moment, we lost complete control of the movement, and the movement itself found the solution to our isolation and to the problem. And there's nobody that could have predicted and defined that. Now, that shows that mass movements have incredible creativity. And what we have to do is not develop ideal utopian schemes before we get involved in mass struggle, but be smart enough to understand and analyze them when they erupt. Thank you.
I agree with Raji's sentiments, but not with, I guess, some of the analysis behind it. And this gets back to something that just keeps being assumed in this room, which I think is fundamentally wrong. Life is hell for people, but capitalism is actually doing very well. Capitalists are rolling in the dough. There's no profitability crisis for capitalists. They're rolling in the dough. You know, if you take a look at what's actually happened over the last 20 or 30 years, this has been one of the most dynamic periods for capitalism in its history. In terms of technology, you know, you compare it to the 50s or 60s, when a good part of the globe was outside of private capital accumulation. China's integrated. Soviet Union's integrated. There are very few countries, if any, who are thinking about leaving capitalism. There used to be all kinds of liberation movements. Privatization taking place. You know, workers dependent on the stock market and cheering the stock market when it goes up because it increases their pensions, even if it's going up, because there's been more restructuring and layoffs. Capitalism is winning. I mean, that's the specificity we have to start with, not that capitalism is on the decline. And how are we going to deal with this? Capitalism isn't going to disappear in 25 years. If we think that the world's going to end in 25 years, unless capitalism is gotten rid of, well, we might as well give up. I mean, the question is, do we want to build a long-term movement to change capitalism? Now, Raji's obviously right about, you know, there's all these things that you just don't expect. If you ask, in 1932, it was commonly thought that the notion of industrial unionism was a simply insane idea. How are you going to get these immigrant workers who can't even speak the same language to come together to take on the largest companies in the world without the backing of any unions? And it exploded. It surprised everybody. So that, you know, that I think is an absolutely right sentiment. But we also just have to be clear about the limits of the struggles that are going on. When you look at the Quebec student movement, it was incredible because they organized for at least 7 years. They organized the mass movement when they couldn't get to the unions. They were responsible for defeating a government, and a new social democratic government got elected. But that same social democratic government has now changed its position on fees. Students were fighting for free fees. They're not only not frozen, they're now going to rise automatically over time. So, you know, those are very, you know, the question about the Quebec student movement isn't that it sparked something that's going to become a revolution or that they want a victory that is permanent. The question is, what's going to happen to all those people who learn how to mobilize and organize? That's the question. Where are they going? Are they going to be in the workforce? Are they going to be academics? And, you know, what's going to happen to them there? So those are the kind of questions we have to address.
Okay. Go ahead, Richard, and then maybe we can take concluding remarks.
I think that the problem with talking about struggles and movements is that most struggles in the world now, particularly economic struggles against neoliberalism, they're defensive struggles. They're struggles against austerity offensives, struggles against attempts to cut wages and all of these things. And, you know, sometimes they win what I would say are temporary victories. But I think that if you're fighting defense for decade after decade, the prognosis isn't very good. And I think that this is when I hear phrases like new forms of revolution, I don't know what that means. I mean, I think that the fundamental historical problem now is the same as it was 100 years ago. It's old-fashioned view.
Let's just go through very briefly and take concluding remarks from each of the speakers, and then we can end the evening. Sorry that this has gone on so late. We got kind of a late start. So maybe just beginning with Roger and moving down the kind of initial order, if we could.
Well, thank you very much for listening to me. I often accused of putting forward an optimistic view. And I think in times where pessimism rules, you have to put an optimistic view. It's not something divorced from reality, and it's something I think that is linked with ongoing struggles. It's very difficult, I think, within the confines of the United States to get a full understanding of the incredible variety of struggles that are going on around the world. But if you engage with other movements around the world, if you go and see what is happening in the Middle East, if you talk to people in Southern Europe, if you engage in movements in Latin America, if you talk to people in South Africa, you see that things are bubbling and changing. And you see that the kind of questions that you're posing today, sometimes, I'll moderate my remarks, Richard, my regrets, sometimes class struggles, mass struggles begin to unearth a possible solution to the questions that we seem to be posing in an abstract way. And I would encourage all of you, young activists, young socialists, young revolutionaries, to engage in that kind of practice, in that kind of militancy, because I don't think you can find an answer outside being engaged in ongoing class and mass struggles. Thank you.
I was in a meeting about a month ago with home care workers. We were talking about what kind of organizing could take place amongst home care workers. And I was suggesting we form a structure and start thinking about how we raise some funds because it's going to cost some money. And one of the organizers said that I was full of shit, that we had to start with getting the money from the people in the room. And I thought he was nuts. And all the women were nodding their heads. They were making the minimum wage. They had cut their hours so that they could only be at one place for an hour, and then they had to spend the rest of the time traveling without getting paid. But what they were saying was, and agreeing to, was that if they were going to be organized, they had to actually make an additional sacrifice themselves. And this is where the struggle's at.
I guess my view of this is not that different from Roger or Sam's. I think you can't, it's impossible to simply ignore the actual movements and struggles as they're going on. The fact of the matter is the United States is not organized, the left isn't organized around unions. And it's not organized about, simply around class. It's organized primarily around identity groups and interest groups. And I think the issue is to try and figure out, in very concrete terms, if you want to put it this way, what it is that we want as socialists or as Marxists. And the way you do that is to find out and to go into these different groupings, these different interests, these different interest groups, identity movements, what have you, and push a certain line. And that line is to define a set of issues which are relevant to the working class elements of each of the existing associations, interest groups, and the like, but privilege none of them. And I'll give you a very simple example. I was very close to people who were involved in the AIDS fight in New York. And the question arose, they're not getting enough care. And one position was, well, we should put forward a set of reforms just for AIDS, a set of demands just for those people with AIDS, because they're the sickest. It's a reasonable position. My friend and associate put forward a different position. He said, instead of doing it that way, let's call for an expansion of catastrophic care insurance for which other workers can benefit. That's an example of the class ideal. It's an idea that I've sort of put forward. As for the rest, we do have to think about what forms of organization we're going to go with. But the first thing is we have to figure out what it is we want. Nobody in the 19th century and the 20th century had any question with respect to what the revolution meant. Here's what the revolution meant for the Social Democrats. You basically institute a set of programs, nationalization and municipalism, that changed the priorities of the production process to workers, or people before profits, as the communists used to say. Everybody knew they wanted a republic. And the position with, historically, is that the labor movement was strongest in areas where it could institute a republic. The revolution was about bringing about a republic, not about changing, simply transforming an economic structure. And the way they thought they would do it is is that the system would result in war, which it did. So, change of priorities in the economic process, clear-cut commitment to a republic with bourgeois limits so that workers can organize, and the final thing was a secular ideology, basically from the Enlightenment, that would sort of guide the new society. Today, nobody's sure anymore. If I asked people in the room, I'm sure if we asked people in the room, there'd be 1,000 different ideas of what the revolution means. And I think we have to be clear about that.
Well, in Canada, you could still struggle for a republic.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, if Aaron would...
Okay.
And certainly in the Middle East, you could still struggle for a republic.
I think Sam's provocation is provocative. How is it possible? I can't understand how it's possible to think that there's no capitalist crisis today. Look, the rapid growth of capitalist economies leads to a kind of continuous growth in the demand for labor. Under conditions where capitalist economies are growing very rapidly, the fact that unemployment falls and a rapid demand for labor creates conditions under which workers can press their interest by refusing to work. Is that the situation that we live in today? Of course not. We live in a situation where capitalist economies have been growing very slowly, where the demand for labor has been very slack, and where workers increasingly find themselves to be more or less superfluous to the production process, and where they can only take jobs by accepting increasing conditions of immiseration. We live under conditions of continuous austerity. Austerity, again, resulting from slack capitalist economies, low rates of profit, a situation in which we live in a capitalist economy. It's only possible for people to live at all under these conditions where capitalist interests are respected. And in order for capitalist interests to be respected under conditions of long-term capitalist crisis, it's only possible under conditions of austerity, under conditions of falling taxation on corporations, blah, blah, blah. I mean, these are the conditions in which we live. It seems very strange to me to think that these conditions are likely to get better in the coming period. Now, I agree, largely with a lot of what Roger said, because I think Roger's paying attention to the specificity of a kind of, erupting class struggle, even under these conditions, right? Which seem in a lot of ways hopeless. Yes, it's true, austerity, it sucks. And every time people fight, they win temporary gains and then they lose some more. But that doesn't mean the idea that you can just sit things out because you're fucked and, your attempts to win haven't worked is just insane. Right? People find under these conditions when they're being screwed out of school, or when they're going to go into massive debt, or when they can't get jobs, or when the police are killing them in the streets because they are a youth surplus that is completely uninteresting to capital. Under those conditions, people have to fight. People have to fight. They do fight. They find new tactics. They find new forms of organization. That's the period in which we live today. The only thing I would add is that it's very important to pay attention to the kinds of affirmations that are possible under those conditions, that is, say, under the conditions of struggle today. Look at, the recent history of struggle. Look at the anti-globalization movement. Look at Occupy. Look at the Syntagma Square, all of the kind of indignant movements. They don't organize themselves around an affirmation of class identity. That's a feature of the present moment. That's very important, right? And it doesn't just emerge from a kind of bad idea on the left. It emerges from real conditions that people find themselves in, where it's very hard to affirm their existence as work and see something utopian in the vision of a worker's world. And I mean, if you think that that's not the conditions of what utopia meant in this earlier period, I have to say, I think you're crazy. And under these conditions, yes, people will have to struggle, and they'll have to find new ways of composing themselves. They'll have to find new ideas about revolution. That's the period we live in. And in a certain basic sense, I'd have to end with agreeing with Roger in this basic sense that people they have to get involved in struggle. People are struggling. The conditions of revolution emerge from struggle. That's it.
Richard, like the last word.
It's true that in the ultimate sense that the conditions of revolution emerge from struggle, but there are many different forms of struggle. I don't think that people, quote, necessarily have to struggle, and people often struggle in bad ways. I think that like one of the things one has seen from the Arab Spring is the problematic character of just the fact of, quote, a mass movement. And I just want to end on a single fundamental note, which is one of the ideas that emerged from the Enlightenment, and which is connected to the idea of utopia, is the idea that people could consciously transform society. And that idea has been taken over by the socialist movement of the 19th century. And it's fundamentally at the heart of the Marxist project, the idea that humanity collectively can liberate itself and restructure society in a conscious way. And ultimately, the fate of humanity and the fate of the Marxist project depends upon the extent to which people, not just a few people, but millions, billions of people, can be convinced that that's true. I don't think that that problem ultimately is an economic problem. I mean, people struggle when there's austerity. People can also struggle sometimes more when they feel greater job security. I don't think that one can reduce the question of struggle to economics. I think it has an autonomous ideological component that is part of the broader question about what the left means. And that the left is a broader question, a question of a problem of human freedom ultimately, and not just of social struggle.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers for participating this evening, and thank everybody in the audience for sticking with us until kind of pretty late after a long day. We'll be reconvening tomorrow morning for a couple of public events that are addressing Platypus itself, and then be concluding our convention. So thanks again.
All right.
Okay. Do you want me to get the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.